acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this week we spoke to Integrative Psychologist Nigel Denning. Nigel is the director of the Mind Medicine Institute, which is dedicated towards training people in psychedelic therapy. Now, it's such an interesting story, psychedelic therapy, because the research was done in the 50s and the 60s, and it was incredibly promising because so many challenging mental health issues were dealt with very successfully using this therapy. Mental health issues which are generally considered intractable in our day and age. Post-traumatic stress, chronic intractable depression. These things are managed at the best, but are they cured? And I know that's a big word to say when it comes to mental health. But the interesting thing about psychedelic therapy, as we discuss in great detail in this, it's just a fantastic episode with Nigel, and his co-director, Dr. Trail Dowie, is going to be a guest in another podcast. But it was so wonderful to talk to him. We covered so many different areas, but he made the point that people who had experienced this would reflect on the therapy to deal with mental health issues as one of the 5 most meaningful experiences in their lives. And that research that statement is even true many, many years after the therapy. Now, there aren't many treatments in healthcare, be they physical or mental, where one would ever say that they are one of the 5 top experiences in a person's life. But of course, what happened was that in the early 70s, Richard Nixon banned psychedelic therapy because it was finding its way into recreational use and was creating all sorts of issues that he felt were potentially threatening to his ability for a Republican in wartime Vietnam to be, in wartime when the Vietnam War was on, to be re-elected. And that began a war on drugs. And like any war, it's like so many wars, similar wars being the war on poverty, the war on hunger, the war on drugs, the war on terror. Well, let's explore each of those. The war on drugs, how did that go? Well, the war on drugs has created a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry in illicit drugs and has created jails and communities scarred by crime because drugs have become illegal. Now, when one looks at drugs, probably the most serious drugs that cause the most harm in our community, without a doubt, deaths, social disruption, violence, these are serious, serious drugs which we really need to approach very cautiously. Of course, we don't. They are alcohol and tobacco. Tobacco has certainly had its day. I think I think now only about 14% of the population smoke, whereas at one point it was 30 or 40% or more. So, but these drugs are legal, and yet drugs like LSD, like ecstasy, MDMA, like cannabis, which actually very rarely result in violence or death, and yet are the subject of draconian laws, which have found many people who have recreationally used these drugs in prison, and begins a lifelong challenge, not just to them, their families and the community. And it's actually interesting, while we're talking about the war on drugs, I have had in my own practice people who are senior police officers, undercover drug agent, barristers, judges. You read in the paper about former DPPs, Department of Public Prosecution, or ombudsmen, or heads of police departments, and almost to a T, when you ask them, has the war on drugs worked, they would just roll their eyes and say, no, it definitely hasn't. It keeps us in employment, but nothing more than that. And I remember talking to an undercover drug policeman who came into my practice with a torn jeans and torn T-shirt, and from the back of his pants pulled out a gun and put it on the bench. And I said to him, hey, Bill, tell me, are we winning the war on drugs? And he just laughed and he said, look, we would probably get 5% of the illicit drugs, but it keeps us employed. So almost uniformly, universally, be they law enforcement or health people, say the war on drugs has been an abject failure. And yet the defenders of law and order will always seem to speak the loudest. And I often think that politicians or bureaucrats that are supporting the war on drugs, they're one of two things. Either they're completely ignorant of the evidence, just completely ignorant, or they are complicit in the undercover industry. And I think they are really the only two alternatives that I can think of why any rational person who objectively explores the statistics, both from a social, from a financial, from a health perspective, could conclude that the war on drugs has been a success. And it has deprived us of one of the really most greatest potential tools for dealing with intractable mental health issues. I've often said this, that the current health management system that we have, which is managing chronic disease, is a great economic model. It's just not a very good health model. And we explore what a great health tool the psychedelic therapies is, as well as discuss a whole range of things around psychotherapy. And actually, while we're on the war on things, how about the war on hunger? But the war on hunger, how about that? Well, I was also very privileged about a year or two ago to speak to Paul Ehrlich, Professor Paul Ehrlich from Stanford University, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb in the late 60s and predicted that there would not be enough food to eat for the population as it expanded. And when I spoke to him a year and a half ago, he said, I asked him, how do you reflect on the war on hunger and your prediction that we wouldn't have enough food to eat? And of course, the Green Revolution of the 70s resulted in an epidemic in obesity, which Paul Ehrlich agreed he didn't see that coming. While there are still 600 or 700 million people who do not have enough food to eat, what he didn't predict was that there would be 1.6 billion people who are either overweight or obese. And the food revolution, which developed as a result of the use of chemicals, fertilizers, industrial animal agriculture, which is a topic we've covered many times on this podcast, as opposed to regenerative animal agricultural practices. They all delivered seemingly cheap food to us, which has resulted in, and I say seemingly cheap because when you factor in the health and environmental costs of this war on hunger, then we have paid a very high price, because heart disease still number one killer, killing 18 million people a year. Cancer number two, killing about 10 million people a year. Diabetes, a growing problem, wasn't a problem so much in the 1960s when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book, is now claiming at least 4.5 million people a year. And I say at least because if you have type 2 diabetes, it predisposes you to a whole range of diseases, including heart disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions, the complications of the pandemic as well. Mentioned autoimmune conditions have skyrocketed. In the 1950s, there were considered to be about 20 or 30 autoimmune conditions. That's the body attacking itself. After the war on hunger, there are now 100 autoimmune conditions. So, in answer, when I asked Paul Ehrlich what he thought of his prediction, he said, too early to call. Too early to call. Yes, we have solved as many people may be going hungry as were, but there are many other problems. So we had the war on drugs, the war on hunger. What about the war on poverty? Yes, certainly hundreds of millions of people have been dragged out of poverty, abject poverty, which is described as having a dirt floor, not having access to electricity or clean water or sewerage, and earning less than $1 a day. So literally by those criteria, hundreds of millions of people have moved out of poverty, in extreme poverty, into poverty and a sort of a middle class. And that's true. And certainly the middle class has had access to many things we did not have access to when the war on poverty was declared. Many of you may remember a time when we all owned banks as a community. We all owned services as a community. We all owned telecommunications as a community. And then following on from the 1970s, leading into the 1980s and the beginning of neoliberalism, the market-driven economy allowed us, and all these things were privatized, we were then given credit to go and buy what we used to own and get shares in companies that we used to own. And we could even have credit cards that would allow us to go out and buy whatever we wanted, and loans to get whatever we wanted. I remember when I came back from England in 1980 and I had to buy a dental practice of a retiring dentist. And the practice cost at that stage something like $30,000. Now, bear in mind, an apartment that I was looking at buying as well cost $30,000 at the same time. So that was quite a lot of money there. But the bank was not going to lend me, a dentist, $30,000 unless my parents put their house up as collateral for that loan, because I, as a dentist, was considered too great a risk to loan that amount of money. Now, translate that into today's world where we have access to loans as much, a lot of people have access to a lot of money through credit cards, Afterpay, going off and spending, and our whole environment, our whole economy is built on consumption, extractive economy of resources and economy, and we can buy whatever we like, and we buy stuff that we don't even need. And we throw out a lot of stuff. Back to the food, it's worth mentioning that in the war on hunger, 30% of the world's food is food waste. So that's another factor that we need to bear in mind as a result of the war on hunger. The war on poverty, yes, it dragged people out of extreme poverty and took them into poverty or the middle class. It took the middle class into a consumer dream world, which is a dream world on one level, but it puts people under huge financial stress on another level. What it has done is it has resulted in the greatest inequality of wealth in all of human history. And I think when we talk about the top 1%, we really probably should talk about the top 0.1%, because the wealth of probably the top 200 or 300 or 500 or even 1,000 individuals is eye-wateringly, mind-bogglingly staggering. So the war on poverty has certainly had some benefits, but it has also created inequality that is almost unimaginable. And the war on terror, well, where do we go on that one? The war on terror hasn't exactly been a great success ever since the war on terror was was declared after the 9/11 in 2001. We've had 20 years of an intractable war, and now we're in a situation again. So, wars don't seem to work terribly well. But back to this week's podcast, and I always like to ask people what they feel their greatest challenge is. It's an opportunity to catch them a little bit off guard and ask a very personal question. And I'm going to share with you this because I think it's worth listening to as often as we can say it. When I asked Nigel what he thought the greatest challenge was, it was to know yourself. And boy, what a statement that is when you think about it, particularly when we live in this digital age where arguably your devices, your algorithms that track every movement you make, every purchase you make, every site you visit, every comment you make, everything you search, the algorithms that surround you know you better than you know yourself. One of the things, for example, is when you have an iPad or an iPhone, in the morning you wake up and iPhotos has curated memories going back as long as your photo album will allow it to go back. And you look at that and you start to think, wow, I was there. I don't even remember I was there. And I would have made many purchases in my life that I can't even remember, or films that I saw, or holidays that I've been on. But my digital algorithm stamp certainly remembers that. And so arguably, there has never been a more important time in all of human history, and knowing yourself has always been an important part of the human journey, and it's been a great spiritual journey for many. but it is a part of our human journey that we all go through life trying to understand ourselves. But arguably, there has never been a more important time to know yourself, to take control of your own life, and that is physical and mental health. And that really is the brief of this podcast, Unstress, and the book that I've written, A Life Less Stressed, and the work of the Holistic Health Institute, which I know you are hearing a lot more about, because that is what our mission is, to support people on a personal journey to take control of their health, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, to create a supportive community that is free from commercial interest. Okay, we need money to survive. I'm not going to hide that. There will be a reasonable fee associated with it, but I never want that fee to stand in the way of anybody joining that community, and there are explanations for that. But that's what our brief is, to know ourselves and to be the best we can be. I hope this podcast goes some way to helping you do just that. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.